And as you guys write about, like, Hegel, like his whole philosophical system had this like historical component. And so like, what does kind of, progressive history look like if we don't really believe in progress, like in this moment? I think that is a real kind of, both disillusioned Marxists and a certain kind of, I think the 1619, you could say it's a disillusioned kind of liberalism. They don't really believe in the moral arc of the universe, coming to save their bacon anymore.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to BungaCast, the global politics podcast at the end of history. History is kind of important. George, Phil, hello.
Jesus Christ, Alex! What kind of an opening is that?
I thought you were gonna describe us.
You're supposed to say, talk to our listeners a bit before just saying history is important and then handing over to us. That's what you say, abandoning intellectual responsibility, which is the opposite of history.
Okay. So let me say a little bit more. It's Wednesday, the 27th of April. My name is Alex Hochuli. Yeah,
thank you. Yes,
yep.
History starts with dates.
Exactly. It starts with
exactly. Yes.
Just a sequence of dates. Obviously, that was the voice of George Hoare and Philip Cunliffe earlier than that. We're going to talk about history. We're going to talk to Matt Karp, who last year came out with a fascinating essay called History as End, followed by a sequence of dates. And you're going to hear me interviewing Matt in just a second. But before that, wanted to, I guess, put a little bit in context what our own project is in this podcast and what we aim to do and why history matters, which sounds stupid because that sounds like, you should really go and read your history books, which you should. But we want to put it in a little bit more political terms, because basically, we started off this podcast 5 years ago now saying that, we're kind of at the end of history. And that wasn't just a kind of like intellectual posture or something, but was really about a way of trying to understand where we are today, how it's different from the past, and then therefore what the possibilities for the future might be. So it's a political thing.
Yeah, I mean, it was stimulated by the feeling that there was greater possibility for meaningful political contestation. I mean, that was the original sense, at least, that something had shifted from the end of history regime. The idea that significant political contestation over basic questions of social organization was foreclosed, shall we say. So that was that was what pushed us. And obviously, as we've said many times on this pod, it's a particular cast of history, a particular mold. If you understand history in that sense of that its meaning is given from those kinds of political struggles over these very fundamental questions of social life, of public organization, and in the kind of the formulation of Francis Fukuyama with the Cold War, it was the idea of the clash between communism and capitalism.
Yeah, I guess you could, we sort of describe ourselves as almost like the history boys in one sense, but maybe. It's the name of
I've heard of it.
It's the name of a film.
Yeah, it's a film about a teacher who feels up his students. So you're trying to tell us something, George?
One of the characters, I believe, in that film says that history is just one fucking thing after another, and that's exactly what we wouldn't say. There's a philosophy of history behind the book and the podcast, maybe. I don't know where I was going with that. Not much to add to Phil.
No, nor do we. I think an important point about this, to bring it back to politics, is that traditionally the left has been understood as the party of the future and the right as the party of the past. And that fell away in the end of history, and we're all stuck in an eternal present. What's interesting about Matt Karp's essay, and what I found really intriguing about it, is that he argues, and in relation to the United States and specifically recent battles about the past, specifically about the Civil War and slavery and racism, that it has been the left, or certainly at least liberals, who have been more dedicated to plumbing the past, to be oriented towards history, while it has been conservatives who've kind of given up on the past. Like they don't have, it's not no longer a golden age to which they want to return. And so specifically, he argues that with, for example, the 1619 Project, which was hosted by the New York Times as a way to say that the real founding of America was when the first slaves arrived on American shores in 1619 and not the 1776, which is to say the American Revolution. And in a way, liberals want to just relitigate the past, portray the past as always with us, as these kind of continual cycles of oppression, which we can't really get past. And so it's very much an orientation towards the past, not necessarily in a conservative sense of wanting to return to it, but in the sense of saying, look, the past is always with us and we can't escape it. Whereas conservatives, on the other hand, seem to have nothing really to say. Their attitude towards the past is completely incoherent and is only used in a very instrumental, opportunistic way to troll liberals, to say, actually, this guy who's an American hero is actually a Republican, like, aha, got you liberals. Lincoln was actually a Republican. And that's pretty insubstantial way to treat history. Anyway, I'm not going to continue just laying out his whole argument because I talked to Matt and you're about to hear that interview, or most of it, because the last part of it, of course, will be for patrons only, followed by our after party. And of course, we'll have plenty to talk about. We'll be discussing whether the woke liberal reconstruction of the past, what its political uses are, how it relates to fear of the future, what conservatism really is now, and whether we today need to be trying to kind of restart a continuity with the past or just go, no, year zero, which our own Pol Pot, Phil Pot, would no doubt argue for. Anyway, jokes aside, catch you on the other side. All right, so I'm very happy to be joined by Matt Karp here. We met at the kind of Bunga in New York event a couple of months ago. It was great to chat with Matt then, and I'm really happy to be able to be chatting to you now. So we're going to be talking, of course, about this essay of yours, History as End, 1619, 1776, and the Politics of the Past, which came out in Harper's last year. And this was so thought-provoking for me in terms of looking at the different relationships to history of liberals and conservatives today and how those may have even flipped around, that I'm really happy to be having this chat.
Totally. Yeah. With the Bunga event was great. We actually got to sort of buttonhole Adam Tooze on the end of history 3 days before, the end of history was unveiled once more when the tank rolled into Ukraine.
Yeah.
It was an interesting moment.
Yeah. I think if I forget everything else about the event, I'll kind of definitely remember that. The sort of auspicious moment that it was in terms of, I think it was actually literally the next day that the invasion started. So
I think it was, I think then Tooze, fully ascended into the ether of, the transcendent punditocracy, in which there would be no unimaginable that he would have the space for a night of Bunga casts, bloviating at the bar after that invasion, because he, was having to speak to 17 foreign ministers in a row.
Exactly. But anyway, that was great. But as to the question at hand, which is the past. I mean, the thing that struck me recently is, of course, in the context of the sort of iconoclasm of tearing down statues that you had with Black Lives Matter. You've had previous episodes of that relatively recently, and even now in reference to the war in Ukraine, some friends of mine in Germany have sent me links to images from Treptower Park, where there's this fantastic, sublime, hugely impressive monument to the Red Army, and which was built shortly after the end of the Second World War.
That long, powerful broadsword,
it's just, and the whole place is just so gigantic and so amazing, and it's rare that a monument like that would take my breath away, and it did when I visited it a couple of years ago. Anyway, so some vandals have sprayed on it like Putin equals Stalin, death to all Russians, like all over the monument, right? And it's just like, obviously there's various ways to take it, but it's obviously the sort of attitude to the past, which is just completely lacking in any sense of contextualization or understanding that I mean, it's completely incoherent, right? I mean, the fact that Ukrainians were part of the Red Army who were who liberated Berlin, and all the rest of it, right? So it seems to me like that right there, and even people, I think, toppling monuments to Lincoln during the Black Lives Matters protests. So it seems this attitude to the past, which is really confused. It's not even just we're going to destroy any symbolism or any symbols that relate to the hated enemy of the past, but even what supposedly, theoretically, should be things that liberals, or maybe not liberals, but progressives and radicals identify as their own history.
Yeah, it was interesting because, I mean, so the piece that I wrote, began with the destruction of Monument Avenue in Richmond, Virginia, which was the kind of, the Champs-Élysées of the Confederacy, where you had, a succession of monuments starting with Jefferson Davis to Robert E. Lee to, Stonewall Jackson and others in a row, these, monumental sculptures that all of them now have come down either by, state order or by popular, tying ropes to Jeff Davis's waist and dragging him out in a little car, So, and in some ways, it's this represented for me that moment, the moment of the destruction of hundreds of Confederate monuments, at least, or scores. I think the number somewhere in the 100 to 200 range. In some ways, obviously, as a historian of the Civil War and as as someone on the left, this is inspiring to the extent that it's an ongoing and kind of at this point almost like banal outrage that there are so many monuments to this monstrous regime on the soil of the United States. And the one thing that this recent outburst of protest has done in a minimal way that I do strongly support is remove a good number of those monuments. Especially they've been almost comprehensively removed in the places outside of the former Confederacy where they existed, and that's all good. At the same time, the essay was really interested in exploring the ways in which in some of the same spirit that I think in a powerful and genuinely like lowercase p progressive way is intent on rewriting much older reactionary ideas about the Civil War in America, has also kind of moved in a lot of other kind of higher liberal cultural forms, from the 1619 Project to a number of other influential books and essays in the kind of post George Floyd moment. It actually is not, the destruction of Confederate monuments has not been accompanied by a kind of, a Union Army or an emancipationist triumphalism, but rather the reverse, a kind of a theory of history or a remembrance of the American Civil War in particular as a almost as a site of ongoing oppression, or in some ways, in a lot of these newer accounts, coming from broadly the liberal left in America, the Civil War itself actually disappears. So you move almost directly from the Confederacy to racial oppression in the Jim Crow South, to redlining in the 20th century, to, the host of, murders of unarmed Black men today. And it's paradoxically, even as you're tearing down monuments to a sort of a repressive and antagonistic, reactionary past, there's a kind of a real disinclination to think about the past itself as a moment of struggle when reactionary regimes were toppled and, popular movements did come together to produce change and, in favor of real emphasis on origins and on continuities and on the kind of, in a sense, the paralyzing weight of the past in U.S. history, which it's a very odd way for me as a historian of the U.S. Civil War to think about this period as a period of continuity or of paralysis, when whatever the Civil War era was, it was the opposite of that. It was the most transformational, revolutionary, violent moment politically and socially in American history in 250 years of that history.
Yeah, no, I mean, it on the one hand, I think, as you kind of suggest in the article, is that both in terms of our moment in which we have no historical memory, the end of history, and a sort of discontinuity from the past in the sense of without any consciousness of it, right? That we just kind of live in an eternal present. added to the fact that in the United States, as you say, it's the kind of worst trope in about the United States, that Americans have no historical memory and so on. In that, but even taking that with seeing an element of truth in that, you'd think that, oh, well, it's a good thing that there's an attitude now which wants to turn to the past. And you think, well, that's good. That's a way of breaking through maybe a sort of, postmodern eternal present, right? To kind of go back and look at the past and rediscover progressive moments or inspiration from it, and trace a continuity between whatever, the American Revolution to today and to what we might want to carry out in revolutionary terms today or something like that. And instead, it seems to be kind of the opposite. It doesn't serve that purpose, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's the diametric opposite of the usable past. It's the kind of, useless past, which I don't think is quite, fair in some ways to try to give the most sympathetic account, which, I suppose on this podcast, there's really no reason to be unwantedly generous towards, ideological enemies. But I think I always feel like that still sets up the strongest possible critique. I think that, the people who are kind of pushing this vision of history, this, in which, historical change is really muted in favor of an emphasis on continuity and on the kind of, almost continuous blanket of especially racial oppression in the United States, think that they're just sort of simply by the act of radical exposure in their minds, they're actually, presenting a more bracing critique to the present than, from their perspective, a kind of an older liberal conception of the past, in which it's like, well, 2 steps forward and 1 step backward, and in which yes, the liberalism of a Barack Obama speech, in other words, where, the arc of moral, of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. So there's going to be hiccups along the way. And, sure, you might not like that you can't afford for your rent or you don't have health care now, but it's just the next generation is going to fix it. Like we fixed slavery and civil rights. And so I think in some ways the sort of the genesis of this comes from, some of the conditions that, you guys talk about on the podcast in the book, the kind of the collapse of the more complacent and complacent politics of the end of history. And yet the sort of formulation of them in this new version of history, it whether willfully or not, and this is an interesting question, to what extent this actually functions as a sort of this politics. Some leftists would say this kind of past obsessed, or racial origin oppression obsessed kind of politics in an outlet like the New York Times is actually, serves as a function to divide and suppress authentic, left or class-based or populist movements. Regardless of its intentions or its impact. I mean, those are interesting and we can discuss them. I think it's just intellectually in practice, it is disabling as a, while purporting it maybe in some way for some of the authors of these pieces or they're sort of advocates in the media. This vision of American history, I mean, like from my perspective, is really barren of not just concrete usable past, like we need more hero narratives, but it's barren of a sense that history itself is amenable to radical change. I mean, I know, you said maybe we wanted to get to some of this later, but like there was a nice line in your guys' book about how at the end of history, political change was not just repressed, but sort of actually foreclosed. And I think that is sort of instantiated in some way in the structure of a lot of this sort of new originalism, in which history, in the sense of the long chronicle of the past, is highlighted, but history in the sense of as a space where political contestation happens or change or political transformation and change happens is not only sort of, sidelined, but is almost like sort of unimaginable from this perspective.
Yeah.
And in that sense, it's like it's an obsession with the past that is in some ways a vision. I think if you wanted to get a little bit fanciful in his reading, a vision that is, it's obsessed with the past, but not history, if you will.
Yeah.
It's the past as imagined as a sort of a very long tail of a hopeless present, in which Political struggles, if they're even recognized, are frail and kind of overdetermined, and whose failure is overdetermined by the sort of the coordinated strength of in the case of the 1619 Project or something, I don't know, racial capitalism, if you will. But even though that phrase isn't used, that's more or less the logic of their presentation. But it's not. I don't actually know if that it might be possible to produce a 1619 Project that's not centered on race, that still follows its same kind of originalist and sort of paralytic approach to quote unquote history that is sort of a history without history. It might be possible to do that with other kind of focuses. I think
I would be interested, like even just as a sort of intellectual exercise, it'd be interesting to see if you could actually like cook something up like that. But yeah, it does seem to me that the superficial liberalism of the sort of Obama speeches, and maybe I think you even trace it back from Kennedy through to Clinton through to Obama, right? And that if that superficial reading of history also kind of wrote out struggle from the story, political contestation and so on, that you just if the arc of history bends towards justice, it seems to happen almost automatically. It's a bit kind of Whiggish and so on, right? It's just, America overcomes because there's some essential spirit there that allows it to overcome its contradictions or whatever. And then the response to that superficiality is just to replace it with pure darkness, I guess, right? Where history is just this story of continual oppression, rooted in its original sin, rooted in this originary moment, which then is able to explain everything, right?
Right. And there's the metaphors here seem to be doing a lot of work that I sort of pay attention. I'm not the first to notice this, but I think it's worthy of extended comment. The extent to which, the idea of original sin, the sort of the biblical metaphor, if you will, and then almost even more importantly, the idea of America's DNA, in particular, racism was embedded in America's DNA. This kind of biological or genetic metaphor in which something is encoded, kind of white supremacy or anti-blackness or oppression is encoded into DNA in a way that is essentially trans-historical. I mean, I think you do have arguments of this. Nothing, it hasn't been worked up in the way of the 1619 Project, but certainly you saw arguments about that. About just thinking about capitalism is embedded in America's DNA. Capitalism arrived with the first boats. Kind of historiography of the late 20th century. I think it would be very possible to sort of write a version of that history in which history means we're really interested in dredging up every example of an instance in which capitalism happened in America. It wouldn't be difficult to find to sort of accumulate an enormous amount of evidence on behalf of that preposition. But I think. Intellectually, I have a lot of problems with it. We can talk about, but maybe more interestingly, politically, or maybe more importantly, politically, it's such a dead end in its, even as it purports to be this radical slashing move that is going to chop Obama and Clinton off at the knees and discomfit all of the, complacent liberals. It's actually, it replaces their, nice little arc of progress with just this crushing burden in which, people have this, what's become a very common experience of late, this kind of almost like, sort of titillating, encounter with their own complicity or their own guilt or their own. This has a lot to do with the class position, of course, of these readers and what, PMC politics is like today. But that's what's reproduced is these kinds of individualized experiences with this. And collective struggle, whether it was the anti-slavery movement or the civil rights movement, it just simply doesn't appear. I mean, it's not a question of, let's explain how these collective struggles were derailed or undermined. They literally, in the original 1619 Project, I think is really telling. The book version has now added a chapter or two on those, but they're still really, they don't receive they don't carry the weight of the interpretation. Those popular struggles just, are not what one turns to this version of history to learn about.
Yeah. No, and I mean, it seems that there's an element of historical repetition in what they're doing as well, insofar as it's there's a continuity with older kind of new left countercultural anti-Americanism of sort of in instead of this glossy image of the United States and its natural tendency towards progress, that there's actually this deep dark history to the United States. But one thing that you hint at in the piece, which that was always kind of made by outsiders, or they were outsiders at the time, whereas now it's an argument that is made about the United States, which is in the center of the establishment, and that's an important change in terms of anti-Americanism in some way. I don't know if you'd characterize it anti-Americanism, but anti-Americanism as a sort of ruling ideology even.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because some critics have kind of, taken 1619 and other versions of this, Isabel Wilkerson's book, Caste, which, is a big best-selling book, which I guess, I don't want to say superficially, but I think its premise is to analogize the racial system in American history to the Indian caste system. And in that sense is, purportedly about a kind of making an international comparison. But in practice, critics have noted it, overwhelmingly, is centered, almost provincially on the United States. And in 1619, too, there's very little discussion of slavery and its afterlives in all across the Americas, or anything to do with Africa or Europe, or bound labor elsewhere in the world, or, racial oppression elsewhere in the world. Not that, and that to some extent, I feel like some of these criticisms are just the kind of grad school seminar kind of thing, like, but you don't address X, and that's sort of beside the point. But it just makes me think, because I think that both things are true. It's simultaneously the case that this project is highly internal, and its view of history, I think, is problematically, specifically the history of slavery, which is paradigmatically a kind of international or transnational phenomenon. It is problematically kind of solipsistic in some sense, and at the same time, it does kind of draw on almost that tradition of outside-in critique of the United States as the sort of center of the vanguard of a kind of world evil or something, or maybe it's too strong, but of a kind of a very particular form of white supremacist, anti-Black oppressive history that is in some sense the point of the spear in the modern world.
Yeah, but I mean, I guess that sort of narcissism of it, of not even looking beyond the United States boundaries. And part of that is the fact that it's a completely moralized narrative in which slavery isn't understood as a mode of production. It's just, a bad, evil things that one class of people does to another. But that narcissism, I think, is of a piece with anti-Americanism, I guess, where it focuses on the US on its, as the nucleus of some greater, world evil. But it does it even, if you, again, to bring in the contrast with kind of countercultural or new left anti-Americanism, where they might have rallied behind Vietnam or something. Now it's just like completely enclosed within the US. And that's kind of interesting. And it does bring me on to like trying to figure out what the political purpose of this is, because I have two interpretations to it, which are floating in my mind, and they don't actually, I think they kind of are contradictory of one another. So one is that the attempt to, for example, with the knocking down of statues, there's an element of wanting to whitewash the past, which would then be for the purposes of the present, right? So that now there's no more racism and everything's fine, right? And I think certainly in Britain, I observed that sort of tendency, and even amongst, the establishment in Britain supported taking down of some of the, slavers' statues and things like that. Not to focus on the statue thing specifically, because I actually find that discussion kind of boring, but it just as a representative of a wider, approach. So there, the establishment very happy to see, mention of Britain's complicity with slavery wiped off the face of Britain's streets because the statues get torn down. And so that obviously is a purpose of whitewashing. And then there's the other one, there's the other interpretation, which is actually in a way diametrically opposed to that, which is very much trying to say that the evils of slavery, of oppression, of racism, etc., are continuous, almost trans-historical probably, and that refuses to acknowledge, for example, progress made in slavery. And so there's an element of reconstituting racism even today, which I think there's definitely a part of kind of left liberalism which wants to do that as a way of maintaining its like basically sustaining its claims, making its claims still valid.
Yeah, I mean, there's another. I'm sorry, I'm going to keep going back to your book like some kind of eager student or something. But I think one interpretation of this impulse in terms of where the politics come from that I was thinking on going back to the end of history is it's a sort of a fusion or a recombination of some of the kind of the what you guys call, what is it, neoliberal order breakdown syndrome. Some of that elements kind of inability, refusal to accept, political change and inability to explain it. Like those features are really replicated with a kind of another strain of, I guess, which you would class as in the anti-politics world of left defeatism. It's a sort of neoliberal. I mean, because what's interesting about this politics in terms of where it's coming from the Ivy League, the New York Times, the Atlantic magazine. Yeah. It's coming from these bastions of the liberal order. In that sense, it has very little to do, in terms of its kind of positionality with marginalized, ultra-radical scholars from the New Left who are largely, red-baited or hounded out of, at least the most prestigious positions in academia. This is all coming from all the people who win the prizes and give the prizes. 1619 won the Pulitzer. So it's coming. The call is coming not just from within the house, but from the penthouse in some sense. And so I think that's automatic. The positionality of it is, arouses suspicion as a purportedly radical critique, and I think rightly so. Just from a kind of a really vulgar materialism, which is often hits the bullseye 8 out of 10 times. But I think it's at the same time it is infused with these elements of new left or even new post left kind of defeatism, in which it's not just simply a kind of and I think it's actually in its conception it's really not a whitewashing. I mean, I think I don't want to call it blackwashing. That just feels wrong. Yeah, that just feels problematic. Take that out. But I feel like it's a kind of but in some ways, actually, that metaphor, leave it in. It's fine. That metaphor, because it's just a metaphor. It just kind of it almost has the same kind of purpose in reverse to sort of cover all of the bumps and jaggedness of history with this one unified narrative. And it's interesting. I just go back to something you said earlier on the way that 1619 depicts slavery not as a labor system or as a material system or as a class system, but as something done for moral reasons. I mean, actually, it's interesting. I mean, broadly, I agree with that. I think that that's the larger conceptualization. But there are these interesting attempts to kind of really connect it to, constitutional democracy and how the American system is our divided, mangled anti-democratic government owes itself to slavery. Fair enough, honestly. But then less convincingly, to some extent, capitalism itself. There's a long essay by the sociologist Matt Desmond about, essentially trying to say the origins of JP Morgan are on the slave plantation, which I think doesn't really hold up as a historical claim. But I think it's worth questioning what the political logic of that claim is. And I think on one level, it's like, I really think a lot of people are captivated by, this is the sort of the left liberal worldview, are captivated by the idea of this being the most bracingly powerful critique one could make of capitalism, is to identify it with the most obvious moral crime that we all agree. Even the right isn't pro-slavery anymore. We know that, it's just this sort of a version of, red in tooth and claw, but not just capitalism is like that everywhere. It's that if we can fix this origin, we've really nailed it to the wall in some sense.
Yeah, it's the ultimate gotcha, right? Like,
right.
All of other capitalism's evils, and indeed its contradictory tendencies that it throws up great things and bad things, is kind of wiped out and just in favor of this gotcha of like, but it's racist, and therefore, and that strikes me as indicative that they don't really have a critique of capitalism, not a proper one. It's that it's racism is the ultimate evil which underlies capitalism rather than the other way around.
Right. In the end, it's a material analysis that just comes back to rest on a kind of greater moralism, because the idea is if you can fix the moral wrong, then, you've effectively won the material argument without trying to understand, what capitalism's relation to class or to interest are, and what its formulation looks like, even across the 19th century or specifically today. And I mean, this is a more cynical read, but I do toy with this in the piece, and I think it's a fair thing to say that, like, obviously when you're saying that, what caused J.P. Morgan, the answer is Virginia slavery, you're letting J.P. Morgan off the hook, obviously, and you're kind of almost teaching a generation of, encouraging, potentially politically, I guess, I don't know, politically engaged, either students, or this is going to end up being taught in a lot of schools, or just general kind of middle class readers, to sort of regard this essentially as a moral problem, as a kind of a humanitarian question, rather than as one that involves, force and power, and has only been contested or even in some way, softened by really radical collective struggle, even to get social democracy, as we know. There's just none of that in here, and it's like, where do you go to sort of, so in that sense, I'm really torn as to where to locate this. Is this tendency a product of the end of history? Is it a kind of a delayed kind of attempt to hold on to that politics, or is it? I think it's more authentically, it is a product of the post-Trump world, because this was all written and conceived 1619 particularly, but a lot of this other stuff that kind of has emerged in response to Trump, as a kind of threatened.
I think that sounds more convincing, just because the end of history period is so characterized by a complete unwillingness to really even talk really about the past. It's just boring, right?
Right.
And
right.
It's certainly maybe not in academia or in certain kind of more intellectual circles, but I mean more broadly in the public sphere, I think there was just not an interest in talking about the past. It was, other than of course to reconstitute the monster of fascism here and there whenever it needed to be appealed to, but that itself is something which comes even more to the fore, kind of in the end of history, basically throughout the 2010s as the neoliberal order begins to fall apart. It does seem to me like you're right that your suspicion seems right to me, that it's something very much of the post-Trump world, that the liberals now want to turn to the past in some way to have a wedge in contemporary politics. I mean, and of course, it's not, as you say, in the service of transformation. I think there's a great line in it, which is that in the essay, how can a history grounded in continuity relate to a politics that demands transformational change? And I guess the whole point is that it doesn't, I guess. But yeah, I mean, I did want to move on to conservatives, because this is the other side of the coin, which is really interesting about this. So on the one hand, you have liberals kind of wanting to plumb the past now in a pretty some way anti-historical way, as we've been talking about in the way that you portrayed it, in searching for this original sin, rather than trying to look at history as change. On the other hand, you have the fact that conservatives seem to have abandoned the past altogether, in favor of incoherence or nihilism, as you put it. And I think that's great. And I think actually I would want to just take the opportunity to refer listeners to an episode we did last year, the year before, with Corey Robin, called The Right is Weak, which I guess treads sort of similar grounds, but basically the intellectual bases of conservatism have gone. And I think that comes to really strongly in the piece. So maybe talk us through how what is the nihilism or incoherence of the right in the place of its previous defensive tradition in the past?
Yeah, I mean, no, and Corey is somebody who's been really influential on me in terms of thinking about, this sort of outsized place of history in this moment, for liberals as well. But, and why historians are suddenly, writing all these explainers and getting, are in the news everywhere post-Trump. It's like there is this kind of, kind of historical expertise of a certain sense, which generally almost inevitably ends up making the same argument as in, this horrible thing that's happening today happened before, and it was horrible. It's never about uncovering the strangeness or the kind of, the crookedness or the unevenness of the past. It's almost always about just replicating the past in the present. But anyway, that's as we've been there and talked about that side of it. On the right, it's really interesting. My argument, because I think, I guess just to begin with the way that the sort of the conventional understanding of what Trump has meant for history or for conceptions of America is not at all as a retreat from the past. It's a kind of, in one conventional kind of media account, it's Trump as this purveyor of a very, of a kind of an unmasked white nationalist embrace of Andrew Jackson, of, he's defending the Confederacy to some extent. He says Robert E. Lee was a great general. He's kind of baiting liberals. So a kind of one interpretation is that, what Trumpism has really done is actually reactivated these kind of really deep, organic, conservative, racist kind of impulses on the American right that revere the past and kind of, lament the confusions or the multiculturalism of the present. And no doubt that exists. There were guys carrying Confederate flags on January 6th on the Capitol riots and so on. And there are, there's a continuous, I think, pre-Trump, and it's going to last after Trump, hardcore of kind of ultra-right Confederate nostalgia, especially in the South, and outright, white supremacist or borderline white supremacist stuff. But I think, so it's not that doesn't exist, but I really disagree with that conventional wisdom that that's the dominant energy on the right, because I think clearly what the right is doing, and in particular, right media world around Trump, from somebody like Tucker Carlson to, Dinesh D'Souza or Ann Coulter. I talk about D'Souza a lot in the piece. What actually, to some extent, they've really done in a way that I think belies much more of their sort of cynicism and nihilism than a kind of return of a deep, genuinely, traditionalist, reverence for the past, is kind of accept this progressive narrative. I mean, Dinesh D'Souza is the most extreme example of this, where he did a whole documentary about how, the Democrats, opposed civil rights and supported slavery. And the whole premise was, Jefferson Davis was a Democrat. Mississippi senators who stopped civil rights were Democrats, and they're the bad guys. The Republicans are the party of Lincoln, and they're the party of, and Trump clearly does this too. Yes, he said nice things about Andrew Jackson, but he also famously said nice things about Frederick Douglass, and, who's getting more and more recognition these days. There is this kind of, sense of the past is just a sort of a grab bag of potential of sharp objects that can be used to zap a political enemy, and essentially a kind of arbitrary, desultory trolling is how I feel like the right uses the past in these kinds of ways. There's really not, even in the George Floyd moment. I thought some of the absences were really notable. The right, by and large, is in Tucker Carlson never complained about the removal of Confederate statues. He tried to draw the line and say it's bad when they're removing Lincoln or Teddy Roosevelt, but he did not make a big hue and cry about specifically the Confederacy. And the Republican Congress agreed to Juneteenth, unanimously, this holiday celebrating emancipation during the war. There is a kind of, functionally, without in a way admitting it, there's a kind of an acceptance of, on one hand, a kind of a progressive narrative of history, and then a kind of a trollish attempt to manipulate it to undermine contemporary liberals or contemporary leftists. But to me, that speaks to the kind of the poverty of this historical imagination. There's no, the right hasn't successfully, in the age of Trump, the American right hasn't successfully mustered a different version of the past that can really challenge even the Obama-ish narrative, never mind the sort of new 1619 Project narrative. Now there are, anyway, so, and that was almost more interesting to kind of, contemplate, the poverty, the weakness of that position right now.
Yeah, I think that's, very striking, that there aren't defenders of the lost cause anymore, that Confederacy isn't tolerated anymore. And I'm trying to kind of piece this together a little bit mentally with the description that you've given of the liberal side to things, who at the end of the day strikes me as having won because the right is fighting on their terrain, or is happy to happy to accept their terms of struggle. Their terms of struggle are anti-racism, and so they just claim their own figures for their own cause. And it seems like in that case, you have the end of history. You have liberals feeling like the neoliberal order is slipping away, challenged by this fantasy really of Trumpism rising, of this kind of radical right, the demons of the past coming back. And so they reach for this idea, this historicist idea of original sin. But then the right is actually weak, despite what the liberals try to imagine, and can only fight back with trolling. And it's just that, I think, the picture that comes out from the essay and comes out from what you're describing here is just such a vacuousness about this of this opposition. It's really striking.
There's a weakness on the right, but I think in some ways that historical weakness, or that is, the right's lack of interest in history, in other ways, reflects a degree of real strength, in that it's not overly kind of debilitatingly preoccupied with fighting these specific historical battles. I think in that sense that, that the right is kind of cynically, at least the sort of leading figures on the right in that, Trump Carlson sense, are cynically aware of, the political utility of the past is to serve the present. In that sense, this is totally heretical to say in certain precincts, but like the kind of political idea of Frederick Douglass, I closed the piece with this, my favorite line from him, where he's like, to all of the, treasures and, horrors of the past, we're welcome to use those, but now is the time that matters. And there is this kind of, urgency of now that I think in some ways the right cynicism about history, reflects an understanding of that what matters is galvanizing opinion and mobilizing people now. So on the one hand, we can embrace the kind of, when necessary, we can, speaking to one audience, we can rally on a certain kind of old old fogey traditionalism. In another context, we can kind of talk about the heroes of, right-wing anti-racism like Martin Luther King and Frederick Douglass. In a third context, we can kind of complain that, critical race theory is teaching kids to hate America. And all of these things, even though they may all reflect different kind of ideological emplacements or different historical interpretations, they all are useful in certain contexts. And, I think it's true that I think it reflects the ideological weakness, but maybe the political strength of the right. Maybe that's the way to put it.
Yeah, no, I think that sounds right to me, though. I guess the question is, I guess, what is this right? Because, can it be described as properly conservative? Probably not. I mean, not if it has lost all kind of connection to the past in such a way. So I think that's kind of...
It's nationalist. I mean, I think you can say that. I think its most dominant kind of energy is nationalist and anti-liberal. I think, again, you guys, you continue to come back to the end of history, but in terms of the formulation of where the energy on the right is going transatlantically, it's more towards a kind of anti-liberalism than it is towards any sort of coherent real project on its own that, is capable of taking on various welfarist modes, but also capable of, working working hand in hand with capital. I think, I guess if you wanted to sort of emphasize what its defining core is, probably a kind of nationalism. Yeah.
But I think that the fact that both sides in this are so reliant on reconstituting the other in their own imaginaries as powerful forces, powerful historic forces, I think to me kind of gives light to how weak those both sides are. Liberals need to reconstitute racism, need to trace a line of continuity from 1619 to today and say that everything that is the United States is drenched in racism and oppression. To perpetuate their project. And the conservatives need to say, well, the liberals are coming in to indoctrinate your kids at school and whatever else. And it exposes the weakness of both sides. And I think that's kind of, interesting in its own right. And the thing I wanted to ask, which I guess it's sort of related to this, is that, does anybody have a golden age? Do either of these sides in their relationship to the past, which is now in some ways flipped around, liberals wanting to plumb the past and conservatives wanting to kind of forget the past or treat it completely incoherently or opportunistically, whether there's any genuine reference to the past, whether there is a golden age for either. Okay, dear free listener, general public person, that's the end of this free episode. We hope you're enjoying it. If you want more of it, and I hope you do, that's over on Patreon. You'll hear the rest of the interview with Matt Karp, followed by our after party. We hope to see you there, patreon.com/bungacast.